Story 1. The rain began just as I pulled into Seaforth, a small, unassuming town tucked along the rugged northern California coast. It wasn't a dramatic storm, just a persistent, gentle drizzle, blurring the edges of the cypress trees and turning the narrow streets a deep, glistening charcoal. I'd come seeking quiet, a place where the insistent hum of the city couldn't reach, hoping to coax a reluctant novel out of the silence. I found a small cottage perched on a hill, overlooking a restless gray ocean, and settled in with my books and a kettle that always seemed to be whistling. Evenings were the best. The old house creaked inside around me, a comforting presence. I'd light a solitary lamp, its yellow glow pushing back the encroaching darkness, and the rhythmic patter of rain on the roof would become a lullaby. It was during one of these tranquil evenings, sifting through a box of old local newspapers I'd found at a dusty antique shop, mostly faded advertisements for forgotten businesses and announcements of long-past bake sales, that I first saw her name. Gail Del Rosario. The headline was small, buried deep within a 1980s edition of the Seaforth Sentinel, "Local woman missing." It was a brief, almost perfunctory notice, lacking the sensationalism that would cling to such stories today. Just a grainy photograph, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, and a plea for information. My initial curiosity was mild. Missing persons stories, sadly, were not uncommon. But something about the quiet desperation of the tiny article, nestled amongst news of a town council meeting and a high school football game, made me pause. I remember that night distinctly. The scent of damp earth and salt air drifted through an open window, mixing with the musty aroma of the aged newspaper. I smoothed the brittle page carefully, tracing the faint lines of Gail's face with my fingertip. Who was she? And why, in a town as small and seemingly close-knit as Seaforth, had her disappearance warranted such a muted announcement? The paper offered no answers, only a lingering question mark that seemed to hover in the dim lamplight. Over the next few weeks, Gail Del Rosario became a quiet companion. I wasn't actively investigating in the journalistic sense. It was more like piecing together a forgotten puzzle, driven by a gentle curiosity. The public library was my next stop. It was a cozy space, smelling of old paper and dust, tended by a woman with spectacles perched on her nose who seemed to know every book by its first page. She led me to the microfiche reader, a clunky machine that hummed softly as I scrolled through decades of local history. The articles were sparse, fragmented. A follow-up piece a few weeks later confirmed the worst. Body identified as Gail Del Rosario. Even then, the details were almost painfully sparse. The location was vague, near the old lighthouse road. The cause, hinted at, but never explicitly stated. The tone remained subdued, almost as if the town itself was holding its breath, collectively agreeing not to speak too loudly about the shadow that had fallen upon it. Gail, I learned through the occasional snippet, had been a quiet presence in Seaforth. She worked at the local bookstore, the very one, I realized with a shiver, that now housed the antique shop where I'd found the newspaper. She was known for her kindness, her love of poetry, and her solitary walks along the bluffs. She had no immediate family in Seaforth, a detail that, in retrospect, seemed to contribute to the hushed quality of her vanishing. There was no grieving family to demand answers, no loud outcry. Just the quiet ripple of unease through a town that preferred its peace undisturbed. I found myself walking the old lighthouse road one blustery afternoon, the wind whipping my hair and the roar of the ocean a constant companion. The road was narrow, winding, hemmed in by dense cypress trees that twisted like ancient sentinels. It felt remote, even on a clear day, a place where the world could easily forget you. I tried to imagine Gail walking here, perhaps lost in thought, the rhythmic crash of waves a backdrop to her quiet musings. The thought wasn't unsettling, not in a fearful way, but rather profoundly melancholic. It was a place that held a story, a whisper carried on the wind. The true mystery of Gail Del Rosario wasn't just her death, but the profound silence that followed. The newspaper trail, which had been so tantalizingly brief, simply dried up. There were no further articles about the investigation, no arrests, no trials, no resolutions. It was as if Seaforth, having acknowledged the tragedy, had collectively decided to draw a veil over it, to let the restless ocean slowly erase the footprints from the sand. I returned to my cottage, the rain starting again, a soft drumbeat on the window panes. The lamp cast long shadows that danced across the walls as I pored over the few fragments I had. A single sentence in a later edition, months after her death, mentioned the police were continuing to follow leads, but it felt more like a formality than an active pursuit. The case had gone cold. Not just cold, but seemingly forgotten, like a seashell left on the beach, gradually buried by the shifting sands of time. I often wondered about the people of Seaforth. Did they still remember Gail? Did her name ever come up in hushed tones over coffee at the local diner, or during quiet evenings by the fire? The town felt so outwardly serene, almost untouched by the passage of time. Yet, I knew now that beneath that placid surface, a memory lingered, a question mark etched into its very fabric. One evening, unable to shake the pervasive quiet of the house, I ventured out to the Seaforth Historical Society, a charming, cluttered building that had once been the town's first schoolhouse. It was run by an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson, whose eyes twinkled behind thick glasses. She remembered Gail. "Oh, yes," she said, her voice soft, like rustling leaves. Gail, a lovely, gentle soul, always had her nose in a book. Such a tragedy. She paused, stirring her tea slowly. The town was very shaken. For a time. I asked her about the investigation, about what happened. Mrs. Henderson sighed, a long, weary sound. They never found anyone, dear. Never quite figured out what truly happened. It just faded, as these things sometimes do, I suppose. People moved on. The world keeps turning. Her words were not dismissive, but tinged with a deep understanding of how life often swallows its own unresolved narratives. She offered no theories, no dramatic pronouncements, just the quiet resignation of someone who had lived through many seasons in Seaforth. The encounter with Mrs. Henderson didn't provide answers, but it added a layer of human warmth to the spectral story I was uncovering. It confirmed that Gail wasn't just a name on a faded newspaper clipping, but a real person, mourned in the quiet way small towns sometimes mourn their losses, deeply, but without much fanfare. The mystery deepened, not because of new clues, but because of the profound absence of them. I spent hours gazing out at the ocean from my cottage window, the gray waves endlessly breaking on the shore, each one carrying a whisper of ancient secrets. The rhythm of the tide, the sigh of the wind through the pines, the persistent patter of rain, these were the only sounds that seemed to offer any continuity in Seaforth. And within that timeless symphony, the story of Gail del Rosario felt like a single, unresolved note, echoing softly through the years. There was a peculiar fascination in this lack of resolution. It wasn't the thrill of a puzzle waiting to be solved, but the quiet contemplation of a wound that had never quite healed, a story that had never found its proper ending. It was a stark reminder that life, unlike fiction, doesn't always tie up its loose ends. Some narratives simply drift, like fog over the headlands, obscuring more than they reveal. My novel, the one I had come to Seaforth to write, slowly began to take shape. But it was no longer the story I had originally envisioned. Instead, it became infused with the subtle hues of Seaforth, with its quiet mysteries and its unspoken histories. Gail del Rosario became a phantom muse, a gentle reminder of the unknown that lies just beneath the surface of everyday life. As my time in Seaforth drew to a close, I found myself walking the beach one last time. The tide was out, leaving behind a smooth, wet expanse of sand. I picked up a piece of driftwood, smoothed by years of tumbling in the waves, and held it in my hand. It was beautiful in its simplicity, its journey unknown, its origins lost to the vastness of the ocean. Much like Gail's story, it was a fragment, a testament to a life lived, but its full narrative remained elusive. The rain started again, a whisper at first, then a steady murmur. I pulled my jacket tighter, the cool dampness a comforting embrace. The lights of Seaforth began to twinkle in the distance, tiny pinpricks against the darkening sky. The town seemed to settle back into its familiar rhythm, its secrets held close, its peace unbroken by the lingering questions. I never did uncover the full truth of what happened to Gail del Rosario. Perhaps no one ever will. But the quiet echoes of her story, the unaddressed questions, the profound sense of a mystery left adrift in time, settled into a quiet corner of my heart. And sometimes, on a rainy night, when the wind sighs outside my window, I still hear the gentle whisper of her name, carried on the memory of the Seaforth mist, a true story that hasn't quite been solved yet, a quiet lullaby of what remains unknown. Story 2. The summer evenings in Benton County, Arkansas, could be quite lovely, especially out here, where the distant murmur of the interstate faded into the gentle hum of cicadas. I'd found a small, rather old house tucked away amidst a stand of tall pines, a place where the air always smelled faintly of pine needles and damp earth. As a researcher, I often sought out these quiet corners of the world, places where the past seemed to linger, waiting to be gently uncovered. My evenings were usually spent with a well-worn book, perhaps a cup of herbal tea, and the soft glow of a desk lamp painting an inviting circle of light on the wooden table. It was in one of these peaceful moments, a particularly warm evening when a soft breeze rustled through the open window, that I first encountered the name. Jesse Durkheising. I was sifting through archived local news reports, a project for a historical society that often led me down fascinating, if sometimes melancholic, rabbit holes. The article was from the early 2000s, a digital copy, less brittle than the old newspapers from Seaforth, but with its own ghostly quality. The headline was stack, yet contained, "Teenager found deceased." My initial reaction was a familiar pang of sorrow for any young life cut short. But as I read on, something held my attention. The details were scarce, almost deliberately so, leaving a vast, unsettling quiet in their wake. Jesse was just 13. The circumstances of his death were shrouded in a haze of legal language and official pronouncements that seemed to reveal little while hinting at much. There was a photograph, a bright-faced boy with a slight, almost shy smile, gazing out from the pixelated page. He looked like any other child of the American heartland, full of unspoken dreams. The quiet of my study deepened, punctuated only by the distant call of a whippoorwill. The scent of sweet honeysuckle, heavy in the night air, suddenly felt poignant, a contrast to the somber story unfolding on my screen. Why was this particular account so guarded? Why did it feel as though the true narrative was hidden behind layers of carefully chosen words? The article offered no answers, only a persistent hum of unanswered questions that began to resonate within the peaceful stillness of my evening. Over the following weeks, Jesse Durkheising became a silent presence in my research. I wasn't pursuing a sensational story, rather, I felt a quiet compulsion to understand the currents of silence that had seemingly enveloped his case. The county courthouse archives became my next destination. The building was old, with cool, echoing corridors and the faint, institutional smell of old paper and furniture polish. The clerks, kind and helpful, steered me toward boxes of microfilmed records, a tangible link to the past. The paper trail was frustratingly labyrinthine. Reports, testimonies, legal filings, a mountain of words, yet the core of the mystery remained stubbornly elusive. It was clear that an investigation had taken place, extensive and complex, involving multiple agencies. There were mentions of interviews, evidence collection, and arrests. But the narrative, as it unfolded, seemed to deliberately obscure rather than illuminate. The names of those involved were often redacted, details generalized, and the precise nature of the crime, while implied, was rarely explicitly stated in the public records I could access. Jesse, I gathered from the scattered references, had been a vulnerable young boy, struggling with certain challenges. He was described by some as quiet, by others as trusting. He lived with his grandparents, a detail that painted a picture of a close, protective family unit. The thought of their grief, unarticulated in the cold legal documents, hung heavy in the air. The community, it seemed, had reacted with a shock that was quickly followed by a desire for quiet containment, a common response when a tragedy threatens to unravel the fabric of a small town's perceived innocence. I found myself driving the rural roads of Benton County, the landscape a patchwork of green fields, dense woods, and scattered farmhouses. The sun filtered through the canopy of trees, dappling the asphalt in shifting patterns of light and shadow. I tried to imagine Jesse walking or riding his bike along these very roads, the ordinary rhythms of a young life unfolding amidst the tranquil scenery. The profound disparity between that imagined normalcy and the dark conclusion of his story was a heavy weight. This was a place that held both beauty and a hidden scar. The true enigma of the Jesse Durkheising case wasn't just the fact of his death, but the profound public silence and legal complexities that seemed to deliberately obscure the full truth. The accessible records, while voluminous, served more to hint at the depths of the case than to openly explain them. It was as if the legal system, in its efforts to protect or process, had inadvertently built a labyrinth around the core facts, leaving the public to piece together fragments and implications. No clear, universally accepted narrative seemed to emerge, only a persistent, low thrum of unanswered questions that resonated beneath the surface of the official pronouncements. I returned to my quiet house, the soft chirping of crickets filling the evening air. The lamp's glow seemed to intensify the shadows in the corners of the room as I reread the scattered pieces of information. It felt like trying to read a letter where every second word had been carefully smudged. The case had, in a sense, gone cold in the public imagination, not through lack of evidence, but perhaps due to its unsettling nature and the complexities of its legal aftermath. It was a story not forgotten, but quietly subsumed, like a stone dropping into a deep, still pond, leaving only ripples that eventually fade. I often thought about the people of Benton County. Did Jess's name still surface in hushed conversations, a quiet ache beneath the daily pleasantries? The towns here felt outwardly unassuming, their lives marked by familiar routines and shared community events. Yet, beneath this tranquil exterior, I now knew that a memory lingered, a question mark etched into the very soil of the land. One crisp autumn afternoon, drawn by an inexplicable pull, I visited a small, unassuming cemetery tucked away on a rolling hill. The headstones, some ancient, some new, stood silent sentinel over generations of lives. I found Jess's grave. It was simple, well-tended, adorned with a few fresh flowers, a testament that despite the public quiet, he was remembered, loved. As I stood there, the rustle of dry leaves around me, I felt a profound sense of peace mingled with the persistent hum of curiosity. His story wasn't just a legal case, it was a life, a memory, and a question that continued to breathe in the quiet corners of the county. The encounter at the cemetery, though silent, added a layer of quiet solemnity to the narrative I was piecing together. It underscored that Jesse was not merely a tragic figure in a court document, but a cherished individual whose absence continued to be felt. The mystery of his case deepened not with dramatic revelations, but with the quiet weight of the unresolved, the human cost of a truth that seemed perpetually out of reach. I spent hours gazing out at the vast Arkansas sky from my porch, watching the clouds drift by, each one seemingly carrying its own untold story. The rhythm of the seasons, the ebb and flow of rural life, these were the only constants. And within that timeless tableau, the story of Jesse Durkheising felt like a singular, dissonant chord, echoing softly through the years, a quiet reminder that not all wounds heal, and not all questions find their answers. There was a peculiar solace in this lack of complete resolution. It wasn't the exhilarating pursuit of a clear solution, but the quiet acceptance of life's inherent ambiguities. It was a stark reminder that reality, unlike the neat confines of a detective novel, doesn't always provide a satisfying conclusion. Some narratives simply remain open-ended, like an unfinished melody, their full meaning forever just beyond our grasp. My research, the very reason I had come to this quiet corner of Arkansas, began to subtly shift. While I continued my initial work, the quiet echoes of Jess's story infused my perspective, reminding me of the unseen layers beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives. He became a gentle, if melancholic, guide, whispering of the complexities and hidden narratives that shape human experience. As my time in Benton County drew to a close, I found myself walking one last time along a winding country lane, the golden afternoon light painting long shadows before me. I picked up a smooth, gray river stone from the ditch, cool and worn by the passage of water and time. It was beautiful in its unadorned simplicity, its journey unknown, its origins lost to the vastness of the land. Much like Jess's story, it was a fragment, a testament to a life lived, but its full narrative remained elusive, held tightly within the quiet heart of the Ozarks. The evening descended, a soft, purple hue spreading across the sky. The first few stars began to twinkle, distant pinpricks against the deepening darkness. The county seemed to settle back into its familiar rhythm, its secrets held close, its peace unbroken by the lingering questions that remained. I never did uncover the full, explicit truth of what happened to Jesse Durkheising. Perhaps no one ever will, at least not in a way that fully satisfies the human need for neat conclusions. But the quiet echoes of his story, the unaddressed questions, the profound sense of a mystery left adrift in time, settled into a quiet corner of my heart. And sometimes, on a still evening, when the wind sighs through the pines outside my window, I still hear the gentle whisper of his name, carried on the memory of the Arkansas breeze, a true story that hasn't quite been solved yet, a quiet lullaby of what remains unknown. Story 3. Sometimes, when the world outside grows too loud and the day's light begins to fade, I find solace in the quiet hum of forgotten histories. There's a particular comfort, a peculiar kind of peace, in sifting through the dust of time, uncovering whispers that the present has long since ceased to hear. It's like settling down with a very old, worn book, its pages yellowed with age, each turning a gentle rustle in the silence of a cool evening. Tonight, I invite you to join me on one such journey, a soft descent into a tale that lingers in the quiet corners of Himeji, a story not quite solved, forever shrouded in a mist of unanswered questions. It began, as many of my fascinations do, with a chance encounter. I was not, at the time, specifically looking for mysteries. I was in Himeji, a city most famous for its magnificent white castle, a sentinel of history standing proudly against the sky. My purpose was benign: research into traditional Japanese architecture, the intricate joinery of old wooden homes, and the serene artistry of forgotten gardens. Days were spent in the quiet contemplation of ancient beams and moss-covered stones. Evenings, however, often found me in small, cluttered antique shops or dimly lit second-hand bookstores, places where time seemed to fold in on itself, and the air was thick with the scent of aged paper and forgotten lives. It was in one such bookstore, tucked away down a narrow alley that seemed to defy the modern pulse of the city, that I stumbled upon it. The proprietor was an elderly woman, her hands gnarled like ancient roots, her eyes holding the quiet wisdom of countless seasons. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, tending to her stacks of books as if they were fragile, sleeping children. The rain had begun to fall outside, a gentle, rhythmic patter against the shop's wooden eaves, creating a soothing melody that encouraged one to linger. The only light came from a single, low-wattage lamp, casting long, dancing shadows across the overflowing shelves. It was there, amidst a pile of local historical society pamphlets, that I found it, a thin, unassuming booklet, its cover faded to a pale sepia, bearing a title that, even then, sent a curious shiver down my spine. It spoke, in elegant kanji, of the Kato incident. The Kato family had lived in a secluded part of Himeji, away from the bustling main thoroughfares, in a district known as Shirasajicho. It wasn't rural, not truly, but it possessed an almost village-like tranquility, a labyrinth of narrow lanes, traditional wooden houses with tiled roofs, and small, private gardens hidden behind high walls. Many of these homes had stood for generations, their timber darkened by years of sun and rain, their foundations settled deep into the earth. The very air in Shirasajicho seemed different, imbued with the quiet dignity of age, carrying the faint, sweet scent of damp earth and blooming hydrangeas in the summer, or the crisp, clean tang of winter air. The Kato family was, by all accounts, unremarkable in the most comforting way. There was Mr. Kato, a quiet man who worked at the local ceramics workshop, his hands skilled in shaping clay, his days filled with the quiet rhythm of his craft. His wife, Mrs. Kato, was known for her gentle disposition and her exquisite flower arrangements, often seen tending to the small garden that fronted their modest, traditional home. Their two children, a boy named Hiroki and a girl named Akari, were said to be bright and polite, often seen playing quietly in the narrow lanes with other children from the neighborhood, their laughter echoing briefly before fading into the general hum of the district. They were, in essence, a thread in the rich tapestry of Shirasajicho, woven into its everyday rhythms, a family like any other. Their existence was a quiet melody in the symphony of the town. The incident, as the pamphlet delicately referred to it, occurred during a period of unusually heavy rain, much like the gentle shower outside the bookstore window. The exact date was autumn, many decades ago, a time when the leaves were turning to brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and the air held a distinct chill. The first sign that something was amiss was not a loud noise, nor a sudden alarm, but rather the absence of something, the smoke from the Kato chimney. For days, the small plume that usually curled into the sky with the morning light was missing. Then, the rhythmic sound of Mr. Kato's wooden jita, usually heard departing for work at the same hour each morning, was conspicuously absent. It was the careful observation of an elderly neighbor, a woman known for her meticulous attention to the subtle shifts in the daily lives of those around her, that first stirred the quiet unease. She noticed the untouched milk delivery, the unopened newspaper. Small things, perhaps, to anyone else, but in the close-knit, predictable world of Shirasajicho, they were enough to raise a gentle, yet persistent, ripple of concern. When the local authorities were finally alerted, a process that took time in those less connected days, the discovery was made. The pamphlet, ever so careful in its language, spoke of an unfortunate scene. It did not detail, it merely suggested. The family, it seemed, had passed away in their sleep, or at least, that was the initial, comforting, yet utterly perplexing, theory. There were no signs of forced entry, no obvious struggle, nothing to betray a violent intrusion. The house was meticulously neat, every cushion plumped, every futon folded, every item in its proper place. It was as if the family had simply vanished from the face of the earth, leaving only their quiet, still forms behind. The calm order of the home stood in stark, chilling contrast to the profound absence within it. The rain continued its steady whisper on the roof that day, oblivious to the quiet tragedy unfolding beneath it. The investigation, as detailed in the faded text, was frustratingly brief and ultimately inconclusive. The initial thought was carbon monoxide, perhaps a faulty brazier, but tests yielded no definitive answers. There was talk of a sudden, unknown illness, but no similar cases emerged. The local doctor, a man of considerable experience, simply shook his head, baffled. The police, though diligent, found no evidence of a perpetrator, no fingerprints, no discarded objects, no tracks in the soft, muddy earth of the garden. It was as if the very air itself had swallowed all traces of what had transpired. The case, after a time, simply went cold. It became one of those hushed stories, passed down in whispers amongst the older residents, a mystery that settled like a fine layer of dust over the collective memory of Himeji, rarely disturbed, never quite forgotten. My own research into the Kato incident became a quiet obsession, a gentle unraveling of threads that had long since been knotted by time. I visited the Shirasajicho district, walking its lanes during the early morning hours, when the only sounds were the distant chime of a temple bell and the soft cooing of doves. The Kato house itself was long gone, replaced by a more modern, though still traditional, dwelling. Yet, standing on the spot, I could almost feel the lingering presence of what once was, a faint echo in the quiet air. I spent hours in the city archives, poring over brittle newspaper clippings from that era, their headlines bold but their content strangely lacking in the sensationalism one might expect for such a tragic event. The reporting was sparse, respectful, and quickly moved on to other, more tangible news. It was as if the community, unable to grasp the nature of the tragedy, chose to wrap it in silence, to simply move past it. I spoke to a few of the very oldest residents, their memories like delicate, faded photographs. One elderly woman, her face a map of gentle wrinkles, remembered Mrs. Cato's hydrangeas, blooming in vibrant blues and purples. She spoke of the children's polite bows, and how quiet the street became after the incident. She had no theories, only a deep-seated sadness and a lingering sense of bewilderment. It was like they were taken by the air itself, she'd said, her voice a soft sigh. No one understood. Another man, a retired potter who once worked alongside Mr. Cato, recalled his friend's quiet diligence, his steady hands. He spoke of the day the workshop waited for Mr. Cato, and he never came. The potter simply shook his head, gazing out at the rain-streaked window of his own small shop, a silent acknowledgement of the inexplicable. The theories that had circulated years ago were few and quickly dismissed. Some spoke of a vengeful spirit, a array from an old tale, though the pamphlet noted that such superstitions were quickly quelled by the authorities. Others whispered of a rare, fast-acting poison, administered by an unseen hand, though no evidence ever supported such a claim. The most enduring theory, if one could call it that, was simply the chilling notion of a truly perfect, unexplainable crime, one where the perpetrator left no trace, dissolved into the very fabric of the city itself. It was this lack of a neat conclusion, this open-endedness, that gave the Himeji family murder its peculiar power, allowing it to drift through time, a silent question mark in the annals of local history. As I close the worn pamphlet, its pages now softer from my frequent handling, the rain outside has subsided, replaced by the gentle drip of water from the eaves. The dim yellow light of my own lamp casts a warm glow over the room, illuminating the faint dust motes dancing in the air. There is a quiet satisfaction in these journeys into the past, a sense of having touched something profound, even if it remains elusive. The Himeji family murder, with its calm mystery and its unsolved ending, is not a tale to frighten, but rather one to ponder. It reminds us that some stories refuse to yield their secrets, that some answers remain just beyond our grasp, forever veiled in the quiet mists of time. And perhaps there's a strange beauty in that, a reminder that the world, even in its most tragic moments, can hold onto its quiet, inexplicable wonders. Story 4. There are evenings, as the light outside softens to a deep indigo and the world outside my window begins its gentle hum, when I find myself drawn to stories that refuse to lie neatly within the confines of history books. They are the ones that linger, threads untied, questions unanswered, like a melody half-remembered from a distant dream. It's a feeling akin to settling into an old, comfortable armchair, with the quiet presence of a flickering lamp, and allowing the silence to deepen, inviting the past to speak. Tonight, I wish to share such a quiet contemplation, a journey into the peculiar solitude of a tale from the vast, rugged landscapes of America, a story touched by shadows and still, in its own way, echoing with unanswered questions. My fascination began not in the bustling halls of justice or the stark glare of media reports, but in the hushed, almost forgotten corners of Montana. I was, at the time, compiling research for a broader project on self-sufficiency and the allure of remote living in the American West. My days were filled with the crisp scent of pine, the distant cry of a hawk, and the vast, humbling expanse of the sky. I spent hours in small, local libraries, where the air was thick with the scent of old wood and the quiet turning of pages. It was in one such library, in a town so small its main street felt like a whisper in the wind, that I found myself drawn to a dusty, unassuming shelf dedicated to local history and oddities. Among weathered photo albums and stapled community newsletters, I discovered a collection of microfiche reels, labeled simply, Lincoln, Montana, 1990s. The story, as it unfolded in those grainy images and tersely worded local news snippets, centered around a man who had retreated from the world, choosing a life of extreme isolation in a remote cabin tucked deep within the Montana wilderness. This was not a recluse in the common sense, but something far more profound, a deliberate severance from the threads of modern society. Lincoln, Montana, was a place defined by its vast, untamed surroundings, towering pines, winding rivers, and mountains that seemed to touch the very clouds. It was a community forged by independence and a quiet respect for nature, where neighbors knew each other not by daily visits, but by the subtle signs of life, a wisp of smoke from a distant chimney, the tracks of a snowmobile on a fresh winter morning, the steady thrum of logging trucks on the distant highway. It possessed a rugged beauty, a serene, almost sacred, silence that could also feel incredibly isolating to an unaccustomed ear. This man, whose name the local papers eventually revealed as Ted Kaczynski, lived a life so austere, so divorced from the conveniences of the modern world, it was almost legendary among the few who knew of him. His cabin, by all accounts, was a marvel of primitive engineering, built with his own hands from scavenged materials, lacking electricity or running water. He hunted, fished, and gardened, a phantom in the woods, existing on the very fringes of human society. The few locals who recalled seeing him spoke of a gaunt figure, often clad in simple, worn clothes, his eyes holding a gaze that seemed to pierce through the everyday, reflecting a mind intensely focused on something beyond their comprehension. He was known for his sharp intellect, but also for his fierce independence and an almost complete disdain for conversation. He was a puzzle wrapped in silence, tucked away in the vastness of the American West. The incident that eventually pulled him from this self-imposed exile, and which captured the nation's attention, was not a sudden explosion of violence in the remote wilderness, but rather a slow, insidious wave of fear that rippled across the country for nearly 2 decades. The microfiche, in its understated way, began to link the quiet, solitary man of Lincoln to a series of sophisticated, meticulously crafted packages that, when opened, brought devastation and terror. The articles spoke of academic targets, of computer stores, of airline officials. It was also incongruous, the simple life in the woods, the complex, deadly devices. The connection was made not by a dramatic chase through the forest, but by a quiet, methodical unraveling, a slow piecing together of fragments, much like solving a vast, silent puzzle under the steady beam of a dim lamp. The details were never graphic in these local accounts. They focused on the bewildered reaction of the small community, the shock that such a quiet corner of the world could be linked to something so profoundly unsettling on a national scale. The turning point, the moment the whisper became a roar, arrived not from external evidence, but from within the very fabric of the man's own thoughts. His brother, a man who loved him despite his perplexing estrangement, recognized familiar turns of phrase, echoes of a deeply held philosophy, within a sprawling, anonymous manifesto published by the national press. It was a testament to the power of familial connection, a tragic recognition that the man they knew, the quiet, brilliant, yet troubled individual, might be the source of such widespread fear. This realization led to the quiet arrival of federal agents in Lincoln, not with bluster and sirens, but with a cautious, almost reverent approach, wary of disturbing the profound silence that seemed to cloak the cabin. The apprehension itself was a study in quiet precision. There was no dramatic confrontation, no Hollywood chase through the trees. Instead, it was a subtle tightening of the net, a careful approach to a man known for his extreme wariness. The local papers described agents moving through the snowy woods, their steps muffled by the deep drifts, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the frozen earth. When they finally entered the cabin, the scene they found was one of austere, almost monastic, simplicity. The air inside was cold, still, and held the faint scent of wood smoke and old paper. It was a place of profound intellectual solitude, a stark contrast to the deadly objects that had been meticulously constructed within its walls. The trial, when it began in a distant, bustling city, felt almost like an echo, a formal process attempting to give shape to something inherently formless, to define a mind that had long since chosen to define itself outside the boundaries of common understanding. My continued exploration into this story was never about the sensational, but about the profound questions that lingered. How does a brilliant mind, forged in the halls of academia, choose such a path of absolute withdrawal? What precise blend of ideology, isolation, and intellect leads to such a chilling outcome? The court proceedings, as I read through their transcripts years later, attempted to answer these questions with legal definitions and psychiatric evaluations, but they never quite captured the essence of the profound human enigma. There was talk of mental illness, of radical philosophies, of a deep-seated rejection of technological society. Yet, none of it felt entirely conclusive. None of it fully explained the quiet man in the cabin, the intricate devices, or the decades of a hidden life. As I close my makeshift archive of notes and faded articles, the darkness outside my window has deepened, and the only sounds are the quiet sigh of the wind and the distant, rhythmic ticking of a clock. There's a peculiar comfort in these unsolved narratives, a reminder that some stories exist beyond the reach of complete understanding, like a distant, flickering light in the vast, shadowed expanse of human experience. The tale of Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, is not one to inspire fear in this quiet hour, but rather a profound sense of curiosity. It speaks to the intricate workings of the human mind, the allure of absolute solitude, and the unsettling truth that some mysteries, even after they come to light, remain forever shrouded in the quiet, reflective twilight of the unknown. And in that lingering mystery, there is, perhaps, a strange, unsettling beauty. Story 5. The old house hums softly in the rain, a melody of wood and history. Outside, the sky weeps, a gentle, insistent patter against the ancient slate roof. It's a sound I've grown accustomed to in this corner of the Pennines, a comforting lullaby that often accompanies my late-night excursions into forgotten narratives. Tonight, the yellow glow of my desk lamp casts a warm, almost buttery light across a stack of faded newspapers, their pages brittle with the passage of time. The air, thick with the scent of aged paper and distant peat fires, invites a certain kind of quiet contemplation. I suppose you could call me an archivist of echoes, not in the grand, institutional sense, but rather a collector of whispers, a seeker of stories that the world, in its hurried pace, has largely forgotten. My pursuit isn't for headlines or notoriety, but for the subtle tremors these events leave behind, how they subtly reshape the landscape of human experience. And it was amidst a collection of seemingly mundane ephemera, tucked away in the dusty attic of a distant cousin's estate sale, that I first stumbled upon the faint outline of a case that, even 2 decades on, continues to whisper its unsettling questions. It began with a single, unassuming clipping, its edges frayed like old lace. The headline was stark, almost brutally so, but the accompanying photograph, grainy and indistinct, captured my attention. A young man's face, earnest and kind, looked out from the past. Below it, a name, PCE in Broadhurst. The article spoke of a shooting, a Boxing Day tragedy, in Leeds. Leeds, for all its bustling modernity, has always held a certain gravitas for me, a city where ancient industry meets contemporary life. And the idea of a profound, violent disruption on a day typically synonymous with family warmth and quiet reflection immediately piqued my curiosity. I remember that evening clearly. The fire crackled in the hearth, its embers casting dancing shadows on the walls, as I carefully unfolded the brittle newsprint. The world outside had quieted, the rain now a mere murmur. It felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, listening with me. The initial reports were scant, as early news often is. A police officer, shot. His colleagues, also injured. The perpetrator, at large. The details, sparse as they were, painted a picture of sudden, inexplicable horror. It was the randomness of it that first struck me. A routine traffic stop on a quiet holiday afternoon, shattering into something so irrevocably dark. How does one prepare for such an abrupt transition from the ordinary to the unthinkable? My research, as it always does, became a slow, deliberate dive. I sought out microfiches in hushed library archives, squinted at pixelated digital records, and, where possible, engaged in hesitant, often difficult, conversations with those who might remember. I wasn't looking for sensationalism. Indeed, I actively avoided it. What I sought was the fabric of the incident, the subtle threads that, when woven together, might reveal not just what happened, but perhaps a glimpse into why such things come to pass. The more I delved, the more a picture began to form, not of a neat, solvable puzzle, but of a deeply unsettling human drama. PCE in Broadhurst, I learned, was a dedicated officer, someone who had simply been doing his duty on that fateful Boxing Day in 2003. He was stopping a stolen vehicle, a seemingly ordinary part of police work. But the man behind the wheel, David Bieber, was anything but ordinary. An American fugitive, already wanted for murder in his home country. He was a man living on the run, a coiled spring of desperation and violence. The encounter unfolded in seconds, a flash of gunfire in the crisp winter air. It wasn't a prolonged chase or a dramatic standoff. It was a sudden, brutal act of pure, unadulterated self-preservation from a man who had everything to lose. P.C. Broadhurst, P.C. Neil Roper, and P.C. James Banks, 3 officers, 3 lives irrevocably altered in an instant. Ian Broadhurst tragically lost his life. His colleagues were injured, their bodies scarred, yes, but perhaps more profoundly, their spirits wounded by the sheer, unprovoked savagery they had encountered. As I pieced together the fragments, the atmosphere in my study seemed to shift. The cozy warmth of the lamp felt a little less comforting, the rain on the roof a little more melancholic. I found myself thinking about the ordinariness of that Boxing Day morning for P.C. Broadhurst. Perhaps a quiet breakfast, a last cup of tea before his shift, the lingering scent of festive cooking in the air. Did he anticipate anything other than routine? The chilling truth, of course, is no. And it's that innocence, that unsuspecting progression into horror, that lends the case its most profound mystery. Bieber was eventually caught, after an extensive manhunt that gripped the nation. His trial, a year later, brought forth the full, agonizing details, culminating in his conviction for murder and attempted murder. He was sentenced to a whole life order, meaning he would never be released. Legally, the case was closed. The perpetrator identified, apprehended, and punished. Justice, in its formal sense, had been served. Yet, as I returned to the silence of my study, the story felt far from solved. What lingered for me was the deeper, more unsettling question. What drives a human being to such a point of desperate, preemptive violence? How does one become so detached from the value of another's life that a routine stop devolves into cold-blooded murder? The legal verdict provides an answer for the court, but it offers little solace to the human heart grappling with such darkness. I recall one particular evening, a few weeks into my deeper contemplation of the case. The wind had picked up outside, sighing through the ancient trees that border my property. I had just read through testimony from the trial, accounts of Bieber's past, his life as a fugitive, the persona he had constructed. It was a life built on evasion and deceit, a stark contrast to the straightforward honesty of P.C. Broadhurst's chosen path. The juxtaposition was stark, almost unbearable in its simplicity. One man, upholding order, the other, living in its absolute defiance. And then, there was the sheer, terrifying efficiency of the act. Not a moment of hesitation, not a flicker of remorse, at least none that was evident. It spoke of a chilling pragmatism, a willingness to sacrifice anything, anyone, to maintain his freedom. Was it desperation, pure and unadulterated? Or was there something else, something deeper, a fundamental fracture in his understanding of humanity? These are the kinds of questions that a verdict, however definitive, can never truly answer. I often think about the ripple effect of such an event. The family of P.C. Broadhurst, forever marked by his loss. His colleagues, who endured not only the physical wounds but the invisible scars of seeing such an act unfold before them. The community of Leeds, shaken by the knowledge that such brutality could erupt on its quiet streets on a day of supposed peace. These are the aspects of a true crime that are never truly solved. The echoes continue, reverberating through lives, quietly shaping perspectives, altering the very fabric of existence for those touched by the tragedy. The rain has eased now, replaced by the soft drip from the eaves. The scent of damp earth drifts in through the slightly open window. The story of P.C. Ian Broadhurst, in its essence, is a story of contrast, the ordinary colliding with the extraordinary, innocence meeting stark violence, duty confronting desperate depravity. And while the legal system rendered its judgment, the human element of the case remains, for me, an open question. Not in the sense of doubt about the perpetrator's guilt, but in the deeper, more profound sense of understanding. We can sentence the body, but can we ever truly comprehend the fractured mind that orchestrates such acts? Can we ever fully account for the lingering shadows they cast? So, as the night deepens and the world outside truly falls silent, I sit here, a quiet sentinel of forgotten stories. The P.C. Ian Broadhurst case, for all its formal resolution, whispers still. It reminds me that some mysteries, the most profound ones, are not about who did what, but about the enduring, unsettling questions of human nature itself. And in that quiet contemplation, beneath the gentle hum of the old house and the lingering scent of old paper, the story, in its own way, feels not quite solved yet. Story 6. In the quiet of my small study, nestled here in the gentle hills of the Perigord, the world outside often recedes. Rain, a constant companion in these pats, whispers against the ancient slate roof, a soft, insistent rhythm that lulls the spirit. My lamp, a faithful friend, casts a warm, buttery glow over the worn leather of my desk, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stillness. It's in these moments, with the scent of old paper and roasted chestnuts from the nearby hearth, that I find myself drawn into the forgotten corners of history, sifting through lives that once burned brightly, only to fade into the quiet archives. Tonight, I find myself thinking of Bristol, not the bustling, vibrant icon it is today, but a ghost of its past, veiled in the soft haze of memory and incomplete records. And of a woman, a certain Mademoiselle Isabelle Dubois, whose story, or rather, the unresolved fragment of it, has haunted my quiet contemplation for several years now. It's a story that feels like a forgotten melody, just beyond reach, a whispered secret that the Parisian stones refuse to fully yield. Let me tell you about it, as if we were sitting together by the fire, the only sounds the crackle of wood and the distant sigh of the wind. It began, as so many of my accidental discoveries do, with a seemingly innocuous box of ephemera acquired from a provincial auction. Old photographs, faded letters, a collection of meticulously pressed wildflowers, and amongst them, tucked away like a secret confession, a brittle, yellowed newspaper clipping. It was undated, but the typography and the quality of the paper suggested the late 1940s, perhaps early 1950s. The headline was terse, almost dismissive. Tragic incident at Parisian hotel. The brief article spoke of a woman, Mademoiselle Isabelle Dubois, found at the base of a stairwell at the prestigious Le Bristol Hotel. The police, it stated, had concluded it was an unfortunate accident, a misstep, perhaps. Nothing more. Yet, even in that brief, almost perfunctory report, something snagged. The tone, the very brevity, felt too neat, like a knot tied too quickly, meant to be unraveled by a persistent finger. Perhaps it was the almost poetic juxtaposition of tragic incident with the grand, unyielding reputation of Le Bristol, a place synonymous with discreet luxury, where such disruptions were surely smoothed over with practiced efficiency. My curiosity, a gentle but unyielding current, began to pull. Who was Mademoiselle Isabelle Dubois? And why, in a city teeming with life and stories, did her demise merit such a truncated epitaph? The rain outside seemed to deepen, its patter on the glass like a hushed conversation, encouraging me to lean closer, to listen more intently to the past. My initial forays into her life were frustratingly sparse. It seemed Mademoiselle Dubois was a woman who left very few ripples. No prominent family, no grand professional affiliations, no social register entries. This in itself was unusual for someone found within the hallowed halls of Le Bristol, a hotel that catered to royalty, diplomats, and the creme de la creme of society. Was she a guest? A staff member? The clipping gave no indication. I began to pore over digitized Parisian archives, a task both tedious and meditative. Days blurred into weeks, punctuated by the turning of digital pages and the quiet hum of my old computer. I unearthed more details, like scattered beads from a broken necklace. Isabelle Dubois, born in a small town in Normandy, arrived in Paris in the 1930s. She had worked for a time as a discreet governess for a prominent, albeit now defunct, industrialist family, and later, it seemed, as a private tutor for the children of various expatriates. She was described in fleeting mentions within old society columns, where she appeared as a background figure, never the subject, as reserved, of quiet elegance, and unfailingly polite. The hotel itself, Le Bristol, became a character in its own right, its history a backdrop to the unfolding mystery. I delved into its past, admiring its resilience through 2 world wars, its unwavering commitment to discretion. It was a place designed for whispers, not shouts, for quiet arrivals and departures, not dramatic incidents. The very spirit of the place seemed to resist the idea of a public tragedy. The official police report, when I finally tracked down a digitized version through a labyrinthine network of municipal archives, confirmed the newspaper's brief account. Accidental fall. No witnesses, no signs of struggle, no foul play. Case closed. Yet, even here, in the dry, bureaucratic language, I sensed a subtle dissonance. The description of the stairwell, wide, carpeted, impeccably lit. Hardly a treacherous descent. Why would a woman, described as poised and meticulous, suffer such a fall without any apparent cause? I imagined the scene, guided by faded blueprints of the hotel from that era. The grand central staircase, a sweeping curve of marble and polished wood, descending from the upper floors to the ornate lobby. Mademoiselle Dubois, perhaps in a simple but well-tailored dress, making her way down. Was she distracted? Did she feel faint? Or was there something, or someone, that caused her to lose her footing? The questions hung in the air of my study, thick as the wood smoke. One afternoon, while tracing a faded address from an old letter tucked into the same box as the clipping, I discovered a long-closed stationery shop near the Parc Monceau that Mademoiselle Dubois had apparently frequented. The shop had once employed a young apprentice, now a very elderly woman living out her days in a small apartment on the left bank. She remembered Mademoiselle Dubois, faintly, through the mists of time. She was always so particular about her writing paper, the old woman had murmured, her voice thin as tissue paper. Always the pale blue, with the almost invisible watermark. And never a hurry. Always so calm. Calm. The word resonated. A woman of calm demeanor, suffering a sudden, violent fall. It felt contradictory. The most intriguing, and ultimately frustrating, detail emerged from an interview I managed to secure with the retired head concierge of Le Bristol, a man in his late 80s with a memory as sharp as cut glass. He had been a young bellboy at the time of the incident, full of nervous energy and eager to please. He remembered the hush that had fallen over the hotel that morning, the subtle shifts in the staff's demeanor. It was like a stone dropped into perfectly still water, he'd recounted, his eyes distant. He remembered Mademoiselle Dubois's room number, 307. And something else. She was not a guest who drew attention, he said. Very quiet, always paid in cash. And she never seemed to have any luggage. No luggage. The words echoed in my mind. A woman staying in a luxurious Parisian hotel, even for a short visit, would surely have at least a small valise. Was she simply a day visitor, meeting someone? But the hotel records indicated she had booked and paid for the room for 2 nights. I spent hours gazing at old photographs of the hotel, trying to discern the exact location of room 307, its proximity to the grand staircase. It seemed to be just around a corner, out of direct sight from the main lobby, yet still easily accessible. A discreet location, perhaps. The narrative began to form in my mind, not as solid facts, but as swirling possibilities. Mademoiselle Dubois, quiet and meticulous, booked room 307. She arrived without luggage, perhaps carrying only a small handbag. She spent 2 nights there. On the morning of her departure, or perhaps just before, she was found at the base of the stairwell. The official verdict, accident. But what if it wasn't? I considered suicide, but the elderly stationery shop apprentice's description of her calm disposition, and the general lack of any personal notes or indications of despair, made it feel unlikely. A woman so particular about her writing paper, one might think, would leave some final, carefully chosen words. None were found. And what if it was something more sinister? The thought felt almost crude, given the serene ambience I had cultivated around this mystery. But the absence of luggage, the quiet entry and exit, the discreet room, it all hinted at a clandestine purpose. Was she meeting someone she didn't want publicly associated with? Was she delivering something? Receiving something? The hotel staff, by all accounts, remained tight-lipped. The reputation of Le Bristol was paramount, and any scandal, no matter how minor, would have been swiftly contained. The official verdict, accidental fall, served that purpose perfectly. It allowed the hotel to resume its elegant dance, its facade unblemished. I found myself returning to the details of the day she was found, the specific time of discovery, the early morning quiet of the hotel. Had anyone seen her before the fall? The bellboy remembered seeing her descend the stairs the previous evening, heading towards the hotel's famous bar, though he never saw her enter or leave it. Was she meeting someone there, or simply observing? The more I delved, the less clear the picture became. The mystery of Mademoiselle Isabelle Dubois at Le Bristol wasn't about a dramatic revelation, but about a slow, creeping realization of absence. The absence of a clear motive, the absence of a witness, the absence of luggage, and ultimately, the absence of a satisfying explanation. I found myself wondering about the faint watermark on her pale blue writing paper. A symbol? A clue hidden in plain sight. I pursued that thread for a while, researching old paper mills, forgotten societies, but it led nowhere conclusive. Another quiet dead end in a labyrinth of whispers. As the years have passed, and I've returned to this particular file time and again, the story of Mademoiselle Du Bois has become less about solving a crime and more about the enduring nature of human enigma. Some stories, it seems, are content to remain half-told, their truths obscured by the passage of time, by discretion, or by a simple lack of someone tenacious enough to piece together the fragments before they crumbled into dust. The rain has softened now, a mere murmur against the window pane. The lamp flickers almost imperceptibly, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. I close the file, the brittle newspaper clipping safely tucked inside, and place it gently back on the shelf with the others. The scent of old paper lingers in the air, a faint, melancholic perfume. Mademoiselle Isabelle Du Bois, a woman of quiet elegance and mysterious purpose, continues her silent descent down the grand staircase of Le Bristol, eternally poised, forever just beyond our grasp. Her story remains suspended, a delicate, unresolved chord in the symphony of Parisian history, a gentle reminder that some secrets, even in their very silence, hold the most profound intrigue. And in the quiet of this night, that, perhaps, is enough. Story 7. The city, Buenos Aires, has a way of breathing its past into your present. It's not just in the grand, fading architecture or the melancholic strains of a distant tango. It's in the very air, thick with stories, some whispered, some forgotten, and some, like the one I wish to share with you tonight, simply unresolved. Pull up a chair, or perhaps settle deeper into your pillow. The rain has begun to tap a gentle rhythm on my window pane, a soothing counterpoint to the quiet unfolding of memory. The lamp beside me casts a warm, buttery glow, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stillness and the well-worn spine of an old, leather-bound journal. It smells of aged paper and forgotten secrets, a scent that always draws me in. My name is Elena, and I am a historian, though archivist of forgotten whispers might be a more accurate title these days. I live in San Telmo, a neighborhood steeped in layers of time, where cobbled streets hum with echoes of a bygone era. My days are spent sifting through dusty records, yellowed newspapers, and the often unreliable testimonies of the very old. It's a quiet life, filled with the rustle of brittle pages and the murmur of my own thoughts. But occasionally, a thread catches, a narrative begins to pull, and a story demands to be told, even if it cannot be fully concluded. It was a particularly humid summer, the kind where the air hangs heavy and thick, making even the act of breathing feel like an effort. I was not, at the time, looking for anything in particular. My current project involved cataloging the early 20th century immigrant population records, a rather dry but meticulous task. Hours blurred into days in the cool, silent chambers of the historical archive, the only sound the gentle hum of the antique air conditioning unit and the occasional creak of a wooden floorboard. One afternoon, a subtle anomaly snagged my attention. I was examining a series of birth certificates from the late 1970s, typically straightforward documents designed for bureaucratic efficiency. Most were neat, precise, filled out in the florid script common to the era. But then I came across one, tucked amidst a stack of others, that seemed off. The date of birth was clear, the names of the supposed parents were there, and the infant's name was listed as Sofia Morales. Yet, something in the way the ink smudged slightly near the mother's signature, or perhaps the unusually brief notation from the registrar, made me pause. It was less a red flag and more a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer in the air, like heat rising from a distant street. I pulled the document aside. My curiosity, a quiet but insistent companion, had been piqued. I cross-referenced the names. There was a family Morales registered at the address listed, but the family composition seemed to shift subtly in later census records. A child named Sofia Morales did appear, growing up in a seemingly ordinary household. But as I dug deeper, a faint tremor ran through the meticulously organized data. The family, the Morales, were quiet people, unremarkable in every official record. Yet, the census data from a few years earlier, combined with school enrollment forms, suggested a child named Sofia had been born to them around that time, but the details didn't quite align with this particular certificate. It was a faint discord in a symphony of ordinariness. The deeper I delved, the more a faint, almost imperceptible outline began to form around this anomaly. It wasn't about the Morales family themselves, who seemed to live an entirely conventional life. It was about the faint phantom limb of a missing narrative, a shadow where a more robust story should have been. The original birth certificate I had found, the one with the smudged ink, was linked to a local clinic, a small, privately run establishment that had long since closed its doors, its building now a nondescript apartment block. Its records, what few remained, were scattered across various smaller archives, difficult to piece together. I remember a particular evening, the rain drumming a steady tattoo against the roof of my study, as I sat hunched over a collection of microfilmed newspapers from that period. The projector whirred softly, casting a dim, flickering light on the wall. The news was mostly about economic reforms, football results, and social events. But then, almost camouflaged among the mundane, I found it, a small, almost dismissive article on an inner page, reporting on the disappearance of a young couple, both students, known for their left-leaning political views. No foul play was explicitly stated, just a simple statement that they had not been seen for several days. Their names were Anna and Ricardo Vega. The article was brief, almost an afterthought, but it gave their names and mentioned their apartment, located just a few blocks from the Morales. My historian's intuition, honed by years of sniffing out hidden histories, began to prickle. The couple, the Vegas, had been politically active, a dangerous thing in those years, and they had been expecting a child. The pieces were still disparate, floating in separate currents, but I felt a magnetic pull drawing them together. I decided to visit the neighborhood where both families had lived. San Telmo is a labyrinth of narrow streets, colonial houses, and hidden courtyards. Some buildings, once grand, now leaned tiredly against each other, their stucco flaking like old skin. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the faint aroma of espresso from a nearby cafe. I wandered aimlessly, trying to absorb the atmosphere of a time long past. I spoke to a few very old residents, lingering in the doorways of their crumbling homes. Most offered only polite, vague answers. Yes, the Morales, quiet people, kept to themselves. The Vegas? Ah, a shame, yes. They just vanished. The words were always accompanied by a slight shift in their eyes, a tightening of their lips, a quick glance over their shoulder. Fear, it seemed, was a longer-lived resident than any human. One afternoon, I found myself in a small, dusty antique shop, tucked away on a side street. The air inside was thick with the scent of old wood and beeswax. The owner, a woman named Inns, with eyes like polished obsidian and a memory like a spider's web, seemed to be part of the very fabric of the neighborhood. We spoke of local history, of the changing city, and I cautiously steered the conversation towards the period of my interest. She listened, her hands deftly polishing a tarnished silver locket. Ah, those years, she finally murmured, her voice a low, raspy whisper, like dry leaves rustling. So many stories ended before they truly began. And some, well, some just changed their endings. She paused, her gaze distant. There was a family, the Vegas. They were good people, had a little girl, a beautiful baby. Then, one day, they were gone. And then, not long after, the Morales, who lived just down the street, suddenly had a new baby, a little girl. They said she was their own, born quietly at home, away from the troubles. But the whispers were always there, you see. Her eyes, momentarily meeting mine, held a deep, unarticulated sadness. The baby, they called her Sophia. She grew up here, a lovely child, but she always had her mother's eyes. Anna Vega's eyes. Everyone saw it, but no one spoke of it, not out loud. It was a chilling revelation, delivered with such quiet resignation that it felt more like a sigh than a bombshell. The pieces clicked into place, not with the abruptness of a solved puzzle, but with the gentle, inevitable alignment of fragments in a kaleidoscope. The smudged birth certificate, the shifting census data, the whispered names of the disappeared, the new baby in the Morales household, and now, the confirmation from an old shopkeeper whose memory was a living archive. Sofia Morales, it seemed, was Sofia Vega. Her identity, like so many others during that dark chapter in Argentina's history, had been stolen, exchanged, rewritten. The true events, the ones I base this story upon, are the countless cases of children born to political dissidents who were disappeared during the last military dictatorship in Argentina. These children were often taken from their parents, sometimes born in clandestine detention centers, and then illegally adopted by families often connected to the military regime. Their true identities were erased, their pasts rewritten. The Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, a courageous group of grandmothers, have dedicated their lives to finding these stolen grandchildren, to restoring their identities, and to reuniting them with their biological families. Each recovered identity is a triumph, but many, so very many, remain unfound, their stories lingering in the shadows. My Sophia, The one I found in the archives and the whispers of San Telmo is a composite, a reflection of those countless nameless cases. I tried to find more about her specific fate, the woman she became. The official records of Sofia Morales showed a perfectly ordinary life: school, marriage, a career. She was alive, seemingly well, living a life built on a foundation of unspoken truth. But the knowledge of her origins, of the identity she was denied, settled heavily within me. The unsettling quiet of the archive, the cozy warmth of my lamp, the rain outside, they all took on new meaning. It was not a story of violence, not in the explicit sense I had sought to avoid, but it was a story of profound loss, of stolen heritage, of a truth that remained just out of reach, humming beneath the surface of everyday life. The mystery wasn't about who did it. The broad strokes of that historical period are well known. The mystery was about the individual lives, the echoes of the original identity, and the quiet courage of those who, like Inns, remembered and dared to whisper. Tonight, as the rain continues its gentle cadence, I often think of Sofia, the woman who lived a borrowed life. Did she ever feel a pull, a flicker of recognition in the eyes of a stranger, a sense that a part of her story was missing? Did the silence surrounding her past ever feel like a heavy cloak? We may never know. And that, perhaps, is the most profound mystery of all. Some stories, my dear listener, are never truly finished. They simply linger, like the scent of an old book, a quiet reminder of what was, what might have been, and the enduring search for truth in a city that never quite forgets.